"Get this civilian off my range before she kills someone," Colonel Mitchell barked, pointing at the blonde woman standing quietly near the entrance. The morning sun blazed across Camp Pendleton's elite sniper training facility. Grace Williams, 25 years old, stood motionless in simple jeans and a white t-shirt among dozens of uniformed Marines. Her civilian appearance sparked immediate laughter from the soldiers, their phones already recording what they assumed would be entertaining footage. "This isn't a county fair shooting gallery, ma'am. The nearest Starbucks is back in town," Mitchell added. The crowd erupted, but Grace remained still, blue eyes distant. None noticed how her hands stayed steady, or how she tracked wind flags like second nature. Master Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Chen, newly arrived, recognized something, not just in Grace's calm but in the classified clearance codes attached to her. "Just one shot, Colonel," Grace finally spoke, voice heavy with something unspoken. The laughter faltered. Chen's heart dropped, and Mitchell's smirk began to die, though he didn't yet know why. Camp Pendleton's Scout Sniper School stood as a monument to American military precision. The morning briefing room displayed the longest confirmed kill records on its walls, each plaque representing a moment when physics, training, and human will converged into a single perfect shot. Drill sergeants with combat ribbons dating back to Afghanistan moved through the facility with the confidence of men who'd stared death through a scope and pulled the trigger first. The air itself seemed to vibrate with testosterone and barely contained aggression, a proving ground where only the strongest survived the selection process. Into this temple of military masculinity walked Grace Williams, her white t-shirt and faded jeans making her look like a lost college student among the forest of digital camouflage. The visual paradox was almost painful. Her delicate features seemed to belong in a coffee shop discussing literature, not surrounded by weapons designed to deliver death at distances measured in football fields. Her civilian visitor's badge swayed with each step, a bright yellow target that drew stares and whispers from every Marine she passed. Some soldiers actually did double takes, as if their eyes couldn't reconcile what they were seeing with where they were seeing it. The administrative staff had been confused by her paperwork from the start. She'd presented documents referencing memorial service arrangements for her mother, a former Navy service member who died in the line of duty. Grace claimed she needed access to the firing range for closure, something about understanding what her mother had experienced. The emotional restraint in her voice when she mentioned her mother's death had been the only crack in an otherwise impenetrable calm that unsettled the desk sergeant who'd processed her entry. The desk sergeant, Rodriguez, still remembered how his hands had trembled slightly as he stamped her papers. Something in her eyes, not coldness, but a depth of contained sorrow that made him think of still water over unknown depths. He'd gone home that night and hugged his own daughter a little tighter, though he couldn't have explained why. Rodriguez was 42, a father of 3, and he'd seen enough grief to recognize when someone was carrying more than they should. "Ma'am," he'd said quietly as she'd turned to leave his desk, "whatever you're looking for here, I hope you find it." Grace had paused, given him a look that seemed to see through to his soul, and nodded once before continuing on. Security had flagged something unusual in her authorization codes, but Mitchell had been briefing his senior staff when the call came through. His aide had tried to interrupt, but Mitchell despised what he called administrative paranoia. He'd built his reputation on battlefield decisions, not paperwork, and he wasn't about to let some desk jockey's confusion disrupt his morning's schedule. "Handle it," he'd barked at the security officer. "If she's cleared, she's cleared. I don't have time for every tourist with connections." Why did a combat officer fear paperwork more than bullets? Master Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Chen arrived just as Colonel Mitchell's theatrical mockery reached its crescendo. 25 years of service had given Chen an eye for details others missed, and what she saw in Grace Williams made her stomach drop. The way the young woman's eyes tracked exits without seeming to look, how her weight distribution shifted to maintain balance despite being surrounded, the micro-expressions that suggested tactical assessment rather than fear. Chen had seen these signs before, in classified files marked with code names instead of ranks. But more than that, Chen saw something else. She saw her own daughter in Grace's age, saw the weight of loss in those young shoulders that reminded her of Gold Star families at Arlington. Chen's throat tightened with recognition that went beyond operational security. This wasn't just a security breach waiting to happen. This was a tragedy unfolding in real time. Chen was 51, had raised 2 daughters while deploying to every major conflict of the last 2 decades. She knew the look of someone who'd given everything and received folded flags in return. Chen tried to signal Mitchell, moving into his peripheral vision with increasing urgency. She knew that face, had seen it in briefings about operations so secret they didn't officially exist. But Chen faced a dilemma. The classification level of what she knew meant she couldn't simply shout it across a room full of junior Marines. Protocol demanded discretion, even as the situation spiraled toward disaster. When Chen whispered urgently in his ear, Mitchell waved her off with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been catastrophically wrong about anything that mattered. How long could she wait before protocol became irrelevant? Grace absorbed each insult without reaction, her blue eyes maintaining that same distant focus that suggested she was seeing something beyond the present moment. Why didn't she simply identify herself? Perhaps because she'd spent 5 years building walls between who she was and who she'd been. Perhaps because once that door opened, there was no closing it again. Perhaps because in this moment of mockery, she was paradoxically free. Just a woman grieving her mother, not a legend carrying impossible weight. The paradox of her appearance struck Corporal Davies, barely 19 himself, who found himself lowering his phone. Davies was from small-town Montana, had joined the Marines to escape poverty and find purpose. His mother had raised him alone, and something in Grace's solitary strength reminded him of her. "This isn't right," he muttered to his bunkmate, Lance Corporal Martinez. Something in the way she stood, absolutely still while surrounded by moving, mocking Marines, reminded him of the eye of a hurricane. He'd later tell his squad that he'd felt ashamed without knowing why, like he'd been caught throwing stones at stained glass. When they mocked her mother's service, her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When they called her a lost civilian, a brief flash of something darker crossed her features before disappearing behind that wall of calm. She studied the room with the systematic precision of someone trained to memorize details under pressure. Equipment configurations, exit routes, number of personnel, but between these tactical assessments, her fingers found the small gold locket at her throat, a gesture so unconsciously tender it made Chen's eyes burn with unshed tears. A memory flickered behind her eyes, unbidden but persistent. Age 12, lying prone beside her mother on a Virginia hillside, the weight of the rifle steadying against her small shoulder. But it wasn't the shooting she remembered most clearly now. It was the moment after, when her mother had pulled her close and whispered, "Power without compassion is just destruction, Grace. Never forget to feel." The crack of the rifle, the distant ping of metal on metal, her first bullseye at 200 yards. Her mother's proud smile, rare and precious. "Natural-born marksman," she'd said, then added with sudden seriousness, "This gift carries responsibility, Grace. Never forget that." The memory faded, leaving Grace momentarily vulnerable. A single tear escaped before she could stop it, quickly wiped away. But Chen saw it. Rodriguez saw it, having positioned himself where he could observe. Even some of the mocking Marines saw it, and something in the atmosphere shifted, though they couldn't have said why. "Ma'am, seriously, this is a restricted military facility," young Corporal Thompson said, his phone still recording, though his voice had lost some of its earlier mockery. Thompson was 18, fresh from boot camp, still learning the difference between strength and cruelty. His older sister had taught him to shoot back home in Texas, and something about Grace reminded him of her. That same quiet competence hidden beneath an unassuming exterior. The closest thing to a gun you should be handling is the TV remote. The laughter that followed felt forced now, uncertain, as if the crowd sensed something changing but couldn't identify what. What happens in these moments, when the gap between appearance and reality becomes a chasm too wide to cross with words? Grace had learned long ago that silence carried its own power, that sometimes the best response to ignorance was to let it reveal itself fully. She stood like a statue carved from patience itself, weathering their mockery like a mountain endures rain. But mountains don't cry, and that single tear had been seen. "I'm here for the 1,000-yard range," Grace finally spoke, her voice cutting through the laughter with unexpected authority. The words landed like a precisely placed shot, creating a moment of confusion that rippled through the room. 1,000 yards was sniper territory, the domain of mathematical precision and superhuman patience. For a civilian woman to request it was like asking to pilot a fighter jet because you'd played a video game. Colonel Mitchell's laughter erupted anew, but something had shifted in the room's energy. Chin's face had gone pale, her hand unconsciously moving to her sidearm in a gesture of pure instinct. She'd heard that voice before, years ago, calling out wind corrections over a radio, while impossible shots found their targets in a place the maps called Nowhere Special. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't explain to anyone in that room. Tears for the girl who'd saved her unit, tears for the ghost that girl had become. Colonel Mitchell's laughter boomed across the facility like artillery fire. 1,000 yards? Lady, you probably can't even see that far without your prescription sunglasses. His performance had reached theatrical proportions, playing to an audience of Marines who ate up every word. Tell you what, why don't you try the kiddie range at the local sporting goods store first? Work your way up to the big girl toys. The soldiers howled with amusement, their phones capturing every second of what they assumed would become legendary break-room entertainment. But Sergeant Kim, standing near the back, felt his laughter die in his throat. Kim was 35, a career Marine who'd seen enough combat to know that the deadliest people rarely looked the part. His sniper instructor in Afghanistan had been a soft-spoken woman who could put 10 rounds through the same hole at 600 yards. Something about the way the blonde woman absorbed the insults, not with defeat but with a patience that seemed infinite, reminded him of his instructor. The deadliest shooters, the instructor had said, are the ones who've learned to be invisible. They don't need to prove anything, because they've already proven everything. Kim slowly lowered his phone, a chill running down his spine. The betting pool had grown to include most of the morning shift. $20 said she'd leave within 5 minutes. 50 said she'd cry first. Someone offered 100 that she'd accidentally call the rifle a gun and get the standard punishment of push-ups. The social media posts were already spreading through military networks, hashtags mocking the lost blonde who thought she could play with the Marines. Grace Williams stood in the center of it all, a still point in a hurricane of mockery. Master Gunnery Sergeant Chen's desperation had reached critical mass. She pushed through the crowd, her voice sharp with urgency. "Colonel Mitchell, sir, we need to verify this woman's credentials immediately." Her tone carried the weight of someone who'd seen classified horrors and lived to regret them. There are irregularities in her authorization codes that require— "Stand down, Gunny," Mitchell waved her off without looking, drunk on his own authority. "I've been running this range for 15 years. I think I can handle one confused civilian." He turned back to Grace with exaggerated patience. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave before someone gets hurt. This isn't a place for tourists." Chen's face contorted with an emotion Mitchell had never seen before. Was it fear, rage, grief? Her whole body trembled with the effort of maintaining military protocol when every instinct screamed at her to act. She caught Grace's eye across the room, and something passed between them. A moment of recognition so profound that Chen had to grip the nearest table to stay upright. Chen remembered another young woman, years ago, who'd made impossible shots to save lives that weren't supposed to matter. She remembered the aftermath, the quiet tears, the decision to disappear rather than become what the war wanted her to be. The mockery reached new heights as Marines began creating memes in real time. Grace's calm face photoshopped onto everything from lost puppy posters to GPS malfunction warnings. But Lance Corporal Martinez noticed how the woman's breathing never changed, how her pulse point at her neck maintained the same steady rhythm. Martinez was 22, had grown up in East LA where reading people could mean the difference between getting home safe and not getting home at all. His grandfather had been a sniper in Vietnam, and he'd once said, "The ones who've seen too much death learn to hold their life force so still that death passes them by." Martinez found himself stepping back, creating distance from whatever was about to happen. When someone made a crack about her mother probably being some desk jockey who'd never seen real action, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. Grace's eyes, those soft blue eyes that seemed to belong on a kindergarten teacher, suddenly held depths that made several Marines step back unconsciously. "My mother served with distinction," Grace said, her voice steady though tears now flowed freely down her cheeks. "She gave everything for this country. Everything." The last word broke on a sob she couldn't quite suppress, and the paradox deepened. This delicate-looking woman crying over her mother while standing in a room full of warriors who didn't know they were mocking one of their own. "Oh, I'm sure she was a real hero," Mitchell's sarcasm dripped like acid. "Let me guess, she filed reports in triplicate, made sure the coffee was fresh for the real warriors." The laughter that followed felt different somehow, meaner, crossing from professional mockery into personal cruelty. Even some of the Marines shifted uncomfortably at the unnecessary harshness. How far would Mitchell push before something snapped? Private Thompson, youngest in the room at 18, found himself thinking of his sister, small, blonde, easily underestimated. She'd joined the Air Force last year despite everyone saying she wasn't tough enough. He watched Grace's tears fall and felt something twist in his chest. "Sir," he started to say, then stopped, but the damage was done. Others were beginning to feel it too, that creeping sense that they were on the wrong side of something significant. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been watching Grace with growing puzzlement. At 42, he'd developed an eye for details that didn't fit. When she'd unconsciously used the term mil-dot reticle while glancing at one of the scope displays, his antenna went up. When she'd automatically checked wind flags without seeming to realize she was doing it, his confusion deepened. "Ma'am," he ventured carefully, voice gentler now, "where exactly did you learn about ballistic coefficients?" Grace caught herself, but it was too late. The technical knowledge had slipped through her carefully maintained civilian facade like water through a cracked dam. Other veterans in the room began noticing the inconsistencies. The way she stood, how she breathed, the unconscious way she'd positioned herself to maintain sightlines to all exits. Whispers started beneath the louder mockery, questions about who this woman really was. Could a civilian know these things? "That's enough of this circus," Mitchell declared with finality. "Security, escort this woman off my range. We've wasted enough time on... well..." The words died in his throat as Grace reached into her bag with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed. She produced a military identification card and held it out with rock-steady hands. The colonel's confident smirk began to falter as he took the ID, his face a study in slow-motion realization. The blood drained from Mitchell's face in stages, like watching a sunset in reverse. His hands began to tremble as he read and reread the identification, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. The classification codes on the card were beyond his clearance level to fully decode, but he recognized enough to understand the magnitude of his error. Level 7 authorization, Special Operations Command signatures, and a code name that made his knees weak. What kind of person carried this level of clearance? Chen had moved closer, and when she saw the identification over Mitchell's shoulder, her worst fears were confirmed. She snapped to attention and delivered a salute sharp enough to cut glass, tears now streaming openly down her weathered face. "Widow 27, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I served as your spotter on Operation Longbow. It's an honor to see you again, ma'am. I thought we'd lost you forever." The room transformed in an instant, phones lowered as if suddenly too heavy to hold. The laughter choked off like someone had cut the power to a speaker system. Marines who'd been recording for mockery began frantically deleting videos, their faces cycling through confusion, recognition, and horror. Young Private Thompson, who'd felt that instinct to protect, now understood why. They'd been mocking someone who'd paid prices they couldn't imagine. The silence was so complete you could hear the distant crack of rifle fire from other ranges, each shot a reminder of where they were and what they'd just done. Grace stood in the center of the transformed room, no longer a lost civilian, but something far more dangerous, a legend they'd failed to recognize. Her quiet authority filled the space like smoke, choking out the last remnants of mockery. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of every shot she'd ever taken, every life she'd saved or ended with surgical precision from distances that shouldn't have been possible. "I have authorization for the 1,000-yard range," she repeated, and this time the words landed with the force of a verdict. Colonel Mitchell's hands shook as he handed back her identification, his career flashing before his eyes like a highlight reel of poor decisions, culminating in this moment of spectacular self-destruction. What kind of authorization could make a Marine colonel go silent? The kind written in blood and bullets, earned in places where missing meant death and success meant carrying ghosts home. The kind that transformed a lost blonde civilian into Widow 27, a call sign whispered in sniper circles like a prayer or a curse, depending on which end of the scope you found yourself. Master Gunnery Sergeant Chen's voice cut through the stunned silence with military precision. "Widow 27, Navy Special Operations, Detached Duty." She held Grace's identification like a holy relic, each word falling into the room with the weight of revealed scripture. daughter of Commander Alina Williams, the Eagle's Eye. The assembled Marines drew collective breath at the name. Even those too young to have served with her knew the legend. The Navy sniper who'd redefined what was possible with a rifle and a steady hand. The transformation in the room was seismic. Colonel Mitchell stood frozen, his authority evaporating like morning dew under desert sun. The Marines who'd been filming scrambled to delete videos with the panic of men who just realized they'd been documenting their own destruction. Young Private Thompson, who'd felt that protective instinct, now understood its source. He'd been watching someone who'd given up everything, and they'd repaid her sacrifice with mockery. His face crumpled with shame so profound he had to turn away. Grace's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely when her mother's name was spoken aloud. The tears she'd been holding back through all the mockery now flowed freely, each one a testament to grief that time hadn't softened. Her voice broke like glass when she spoke, each word a shard of pain made audible. She died when I was 16. Classified operation. Somewhere in the mountains where the maps run out of names. She paused, struggling for breath. They sent me a folded flag and a medal I couldn't even tell anyone about. I sat at her funeral with a cover story, lying to family members about how she died because the truth was classified. Chen stepped forward, her own emotional walls crumbling. I was there, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. Operation Sandstorm. Your mother saved an entire village that day, but Grace, what you did in Kandahar? Chen's voice broke entirely. I've never seen anything like it. Nobody has. The story emerged in fragments, each piece adding weight to the legend standing before them in civilian clothes. Grace Williams, trained from childhood by the greatest sniper in naval history, had inherited more than her mother's appearance. At 19, she'd made a shot that physics said was impossible, 1,400 yards through urban terrain, threading death between buildings to stop a suicide bomber. One shot, 200 civilians saved. But the cost. I see their faces, Grace whispered, her voice so quiet the Marines had to lean in to hear. Not the target. The children in the market who got to go home that day. The mothers who didn't become widows. The futures I preserved with a single bullet. But I also see my mother's face, and I wonder if she'd be proud or horrified at what I became. Sergeant Kim, who'd felt that first chill of recognition, found tears on his own face. His sister had been in a market in Afghanistan, had come home with stories of a day when death passed them by. The dates lined up, the location matched. He looked at Grace Williams and saw not a legend, but a young woman who'd saved his sister's life and carried the weight of it alone. That was you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. My sister Sunny. She was there that day. You saved her life. The assembled Marines stood in various stages of emotional destruction. Some had heard whispers of Widow 27, the young sniper who'd vanished at the peak of her abilities. Others were processing the magnitude of who they'd just humiliated on social media. But all of them saw the paradox now. This delicate-looking woman who could deliver death at impossible distances, who chose to disappear rather than become what the world wanted her to be. The authorization codes, Mitchell's stammering dissolved into silence. There was no excuse, no explanation that could justify what he'd done. He'd publicly humiliated not just a hero, but a grieving daughter who'd given up everything for her country. The videos were already spreading, and with them his destruction. But worse than career death was the look in Grace's eyes. Not anger, but a deep sadness, that he'd become just another weight she had to carry. Grace stood at the center of the revelation, tears still falling, no longer hiding behind any facade. The lost blonde tourist had become Widow 2.7, but more than that, she'd become human. A young woman who'd paid prices that shouldn't be asked of anyone. Rodriguez stepped forward, offering her a handkerchief with shaking hands. She took it with a grateful nod that somehow made her seem more heroic than any amount of confirmed kills could. After Kandahar, Grace continued, needing them to understand. I couldn't stop seeing my mother in every scope picture. Every trigger pull felt like a betrayal of her memory. She taught me to shoot to protect, but all I could see was the destruction. The gift became a curse. So I walked away. She looked around the room, meeting eyes that couldn't hold her gaze. I've been trying to find out who Grace Williams is when she's not Widow 227. Today reminded me that maybe they're the same person. The silence that followed was heavy with more than reverence. It was weighted with shame, with recognition, with the understanding that they'd witnessed something profound and responded with mockery. Every Marine present understood they stood in the presence of sacrifice incarnate, someone who'd walked away from glory because the cost of it was destroying her soul. Could Grace still make the impossible shot that made her a legend? The question hung unspoken in the air, electric with possibility and dread. But now it was accompanied by another question. Should she have to? They'd seen her tears, her humanity, the price of being a weapon wrapped in the appearance of innocence. Some things, once broken, could never be fully repaired, only carried with whatever grace remained. The 1,000-yard range stretched into the Mojave Desert like a pathway to judgment, heat mirages dancing above the packed earth in waves that distorted reality itself. The afternoon sun hammered down on the gathering crowd of Marines, base personnel, and officers who'd heard whispers of what was about to unfold. Word traveled fast on a military base, and the story of the colonel who'd mocked Widow 227 had already reached mythic proportion. But now there were other stories spreading too. Stories of tears, of humanity revealed, of a hero who looked nothing like what they'd expected. Base Commander Colonel Hayes arrived in a storm of barely contained fury, his staff car kicking up dust clouds that seemed to mirror his mood. He found Mitchell standing apart from the others, isolated by his own catastrophic judgment. "Mitchell," Hayes' voice could have stripped paint, "do you have any idea what you've done? You just publicly humiliated a decorated veteran, a national hero, on social media. The Pentagon has been calling me for the last 15 minutes. The Secretary of the Navy wants to know why one of his officers thought it was appropriate to mock the daughter of Elena Williams." But Hayes stopped mid-tirade when he saw Grace. The tears had dried, but their tracks remained, and something in her posture, straight-backed but infinitely weary, made him lower his voice. "Ms. Williams," he said gently, "on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, I deeply apologize. This is not who we are." "I know exactly who you are," Grace replied, her voice carrying no accusation, only understanding. "You're warriors, you're protectors, you're human beings doing impossible jobs. Today, you were also cruel, but cruelty is human too. I've been all of those things." The security footage was already under review, every second of Mitchell's theatrical mockery preserved in high definition. Pentagon officials were particularly interested in the part where Chen had tried multiple times to warn him, each attempt brushed aside with casual arrogance. But they were also interested in something else. The moment when Grace's tears had started, the humanity of their hero laid bare. Would Mitchell's career survive the day? The question seemed almost irrelevant now. On the range, preparations continued with mechanical precision. Range officers wheeled out equipment with hands that shook slightly. They too had heard the story, had seen the tears. The desert backdrop created a natural amphitheater where something extraordinary might unfold, but the mood was different now. This wasn't about proving a legend. This was about watching someone decide whether to pick up a burden they'd tried to lay down. The pressure for Grace to demonstrate her abilities had evolved into something else entirely. Elite snipers from across the base gathered not as skeptics, but as witnesses. They'd heard about the tears, about the mother's death, about the village saved. They came to see not if she could make the shot, but if she should have to. Lance Corporal Martinez stood with his grandfather's words echoing. "The hardest shot isn't the one you take, it's the one you carry after." Grace stood apart from the spectacle, her internal struggle visible in every line of her body. Chen approached carefully, her own eyes still red-rimmed. "You don't have to prove anything to them," Chen said quietly. "You've got nothing left to prove to anyone." "I know," Grace replied, looking at the rifle waiting on its stand like an old enemy she'd hoped never to meet again. "But maybe I need to prove something to myself, that I can touch it without becoming it, that my mother's daughter is more than just her gift." Was the cost of proof too high? She let the silence stretch, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. Then, with movements that seemed to age her a decade, she walked toward the firing position. The crowd parted with something approaching reverence, but also sorrow. They were watching someone approach a burden that had already cost too much. Grace stopped at the rifle, placed her hand on its stock, and froze. For a long moment she simply stood there, trembling. Then, so quietly only those closest could hear, she whispered, "Hi, Mom. I'm sorry I ran away. I'm sorry I couldn't be what everyone needed me to be. But I'm here now." She lowered herself into position with movements that seemed to pull her back through time. The rifle settled against her shoulder, and for a moment she was 12 again, her mother's patient voice in her ear. But when she looked through the scope, she was 19 in Kandahar, the weight of 200 lives in her trigger finger, and now she was 25, carrying all of it, trying to find peace in the precision that had defined and destroyed her. Through the scope, the target wavered like a mirage, like every choice she'd tried to leave behind. Her breathing came in gasps at first, panic and memory fighting for control. Chen moved closer, not speaking, just present. A reminder that she wasn't alone this time. "Take your time," someone whispered. It might have been Chen. It might have been her mother's ghost. It might have been her own voice, finally giving herself permission to be human. Grace's breathing slowly steadied. In, hold, out. Finding the rhythm that lived deeper than thought, deeper than pain. The crowd had gone silent, even their breathing seeming to pause. Mitchell watched from his exile, but his career concerns had faded into insignificance. He was watching something more important than rank or reputation. He was watching someone choose whether to reclaim a part of themselves that had been torn away. The shot, when it came, was anticlimax and poetry combined. The rifle spoke with quiet authority, and 1,000 yards away the target sang with impact. Dead center, perfect. But Grace didn't rise immediately. She stayed in position, tears falling onto the rifle's stock, whispering words no one else could hear. When she finally stood, she looked older but somehow lighter. The rifle was carefully set aside, and she turned to face the assembled crowd. "One shot," she said, her voice carrying across the desert. "That's all I needed, not to prove I could, but to prove I could stop at one. My mother taught me that our gifts define us only if we let them. Today, I choose to be more than my gift. Today, I choose to be her daughter first and everything else second." The crowd's response wasn't celebration. It was something deeper, more profound. They'd witnessed not just marksmanship, but humanity. Not just skill, but the choice to be more than your talents demand. Young soldiers who'd mocked her that morning now stood with tears on their faces, understanding for perhaps the first time that heroes weren't defined by their abilities but by their choices. What would Grace choose? A quiet civilian life or returning to serve? The question hung in the desert air, but it had been transformed. It was no longer about choosing between two lives, but about integrating them, about being both the woman and the warrior, the daughter and the hero. The shot had been perfect, but the choice to stop at one, that was the real victory. Golden hour painted the firing range in shades of amber and rust. Grace Williams stood silhouetted against the painted sky, no longer caught between two worlds, but standing firmly in both. The empty range echoed with more than the ghost of her perfect shot. It resonated with the weight of choices made and unmade. Colonel Mitchell's downfall was swift, but somehow secondary to the larger story unfolding. The formal reprimand, the transfer orders, the forced retirement, all of it paled beside the image of Grace's tears on the rifle stock. His destruction was complete, but it was Grace's humanity that would be remembered. Grace found no satisfaction in Mitchell's fate. Standing by her mother's memorial plaque as sunset approached, she traced the etched letters with fingers that had steadied a rifle and wiped away tears in equal measure. "I tried to run from it," she whispered to the stone, "but maybe running was just another way of carrying it." Jen found her there, approaching with 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cooling air. "She would have been proud," Chen said simply. "Not of the shot. She always knew you could make those, but of the tears. Of the choice to remain human." "I used to think strength meant not feeling," Grace replied, accepting the coffee with grateful hands. "Mom tried to teach me otherwise, but I was too young to understand, too eager to be perfect." She paused, watching the last light fade from the sky. Perfect is just another prison. The new base commander found them there as stars began to emerge. General Patricia Hayes carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd learned leadership through loss. "Ms. Williams," she began, then stopped, started again. "Grace, we have an opening for a specialized instructor, young soldiers who need to learn that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites." Grace turned from the memorial, and in the dying light Hayes could see both the girl who'd lost her mother and the woman who'd saved hundreds. "What exactly would you want me to teach?" Grace asked. "Precision shooting, yes," Hayes acknowledged, "but also humanity, the cost of taking life. The weight of survival, the choice to remain whole when the job tries to break you into useful pieces." She paused. "We've gotten very good at creating warriors. We've forgotten how to help them remain human. Grace stood at the crossroads, but it no longer felt like choosing between two lives. 3 days a week, Grace finally said, her voice gaining strength with each word. I'll teach marksmanship in the morning and meditation in the afternoon. I'll show them how to take the perfect shot and how to live with it after. Word spread through military channels within hours. Widow 27 would be teaching at Pendleton, but she'd be teaching more than shooting. She'd be teaching survival of a different kind, how to remain human in a job that demanded you become a weapon. The applications flooded in, not just from snipers, but from soldiers carrying invisible wounds. Grace's influence grew not from her legendary shots, but from her legendary tears. From her choice to show that heroes were human first. Mitchell's final humiliation came not from his forced retirement, but from a chance encounter weeks later. He saw Grace teaching a class of young Marines, their faces intent as she spoke not about wind values, but about the weight of survival. One student asked about the colonel, who didn't know, and Grace's response would haunt Mitchell forever. He knew exactly what warriors looked like. He just forgot that warriors are people first. It's a mistake any of us could make. The important thing is learning to see each other's humanity, especially when it's hidden. As full darkness claimed the desert, Grace stood alone on the range where everything had changed. But she wasn't really alone. She carried her mother's memory, Chen's friendship, the respect of those who'd mocked her, and most importantly, she carried herself. All of herself, not just the useful parts. She raised the rifle one final time, settling into position under a canopy of stars. The 1,000-yard target was invisible in the darkness, but she didn't need to see it. The shot existed in her muscle memory, in the space between heartbeats where perfection waited. But this time, she didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she simply held the position, feeling the weight of potential, the power of choice. Some shots, she whispered to the desert wind, are more powerful unfired. She set the rifle down gently and walked away, leaving it on the range like a promise and a warning combined. Tomorrow she would teach young soldiers how to find their targets at impossible distances. But more importantly, she would teach them how to find themselves in the aftermath. In the end, Grace Williams had proven that true strength wasn't in hiding your humanity, but in revealing it. Not in being invulnerable, but in choosing to remain vulnerable despite everything that argued against it. They don't just learn to live among us, they teach us how to live with ourselves.
Mình là Harry, người tạo nội dung ở Simple Woman. Bạn biết không, câu chuyện này được lấy cảm hứng từ những người xung quanh như là chị, mẹ, bà, bạn bè. Subscribe để theo dõi series và comment cho mình biết người phụ nữ nào truyền cảm hứng cho bạn nhé.